the haunted parking lot in Albuquerque. It was 2 a.m. when Dave, a seasoned trucker, found himself on a lonely stretch of Highway 60 just outside Albuquerque, New Mexico. The night was heavy with silence, the only sound being the deep rumble of his rig's engine as he navigated through the dark, deserted road. The night felt unusually still, with not a single car in sight. Dave was used to long hours on the road, but there was something about this stretch that always sent a shiver down his spine. The darkness seemed to cling to the asphalt, as if the road itself was trying to swallow him whole. Around the 30-mile marker, Dave's truck let out an ominous groan, followed by the sudden, unmistakable sound of a malfunctioning air compressor. His heart sank. He'd been on the road for hours, and the thought of stopping in the middle of nowhere wasn't appealing. But he had no choice. He pulled over to the side of the road, the truck's engine ticking down from the heat. There was no choice but to find the nearest place to assess the problem, and luckily, he noticed a dimly lit pawn shop parking lot up ahead. He rolled his eyes, annoyed at the inconvenience, but grateful that he'd found somewhere to stop. He swung the truck into the lot, the gravel crunching under the weight of the rig, and turned off the engine. The air felt different here. Dense. It was an unsettling, oppressive kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of Dave's neck stand up. The parking lot was empty, save for a few rusted, forgotten cars. Dave wasn't sure why, but he felt an odd pull to get out and check the air compressor. Maybe it was the lack of other vehicles, or the eerie quiet that made him feel like he wasn't alone. But as soon as he stepped out of the cab, the night air hit him with an unnatural cold. He walked toward the front of the truck, flashlight in hand, shining it down to inspect the compressor. The beam of light flickered unnervingly, as if it didn't want to illuminate the darkness. Dave muttered to himself, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping over him. As he crouched down to check the engine, that's when he heard it. A voice. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the groaning of the old building behind him. But then it came again. A low, desperate cry, unmistakable in its desperation. "Help! Help me!" Dave's breath hitched in his chest. The voice was chilling, clear and shrill, and it seemed to echo all around him, as if coming from all directions at once. He jerked upright, scanning the parking lot with wide eyes. There was no one there. His pulse quickened. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the voice continued, crying out for help over and over again. "Help! Help me!" Dave's mind raced. He should have gotten back in his truck. He should have driven away. But instead, he found himself frozen in place, straining his ears to hear where the voice was coming from. The lot was eerily quiet now, save for the faint rustling of dead leaves in the wind. The voice had stopped. He glanced nervously at the shadows cast by the flickering streetlight. Nothing. With trembling hands, Dave climbed back into his truck, heart hammering in his chest. He glanced around the parking lot one last time, but saw nothing. No movement, no sign of life. His breath came out in a shaky exhale, trying to calm himself, but something in his gut told him he wasn't alone. The voice, so real, so desperate, lingered in his ears as he shifted the truck back into gear. But just as he was about to pull away, he caught a glimpse of something. A shadow. It was standing by the driver's side just outside the window. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and thin to the point of being skeletal. Its eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto Dave's with an intensity that made his stomach drop. For a brief moment he could have sworn the figure was smiling, though its face was gaunt and twisted, as if frozen in a permanent expression of malice. Dave's heart stopped. He slammed the truck into reverse, the tires screeching as he tore out of the parking lot, his eyes fixed on the figure that remained motionless in the rearview mirror. He didn't dare look back, but his hand shook as he gripped the steering wheel. The voice, the figure, it all felt wrong, like a scene from a nightmare that he couldn't escape. As the parking lot disappeared from view, the eerie sense of being watched didn't let up. Dave never stopped at that pawn shop again. The memory of that night, of the desperate voice and the shadowy figure, haunted him long after he'd left Albuquerque behind. Every time he drove through that stretch of a highway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there waiting. The foggy encounter in Wyoming. It was the early hours of the morning when Tom, a veteran trucker, found himself navigating a particularly remote section of Interstate 80 in Wyoming. The roads were slick with the remnants of a light rain, and the thick fog that had rolled in from the mountains made visibility almost impossible. Tom's headlights barely cut through the dense mist, and the truck's tires hummed softly against the wet asphalt. He had been driving for hours, and the isolation of this stretch of highway weighed heavily on him. There were no other cars around, just endless fog stretching out into the abyss. Tom had driven through the area many times, but tonight felt different. The fog seemed to be alive, curling around the truck like a living, breathing entity. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rattle of the truck's engine. As he continued down the road, he noticed a dark figure standing off to the side of the highway, just on the edge of his headlight's reach. It was strange. No one in their right mind would be out there in the middle of the night, alone in such thick fog. At first, Tom thought it was another hitchhiker, someone stranded or lost in the middle of nowhere. He had seen plenty of those on long hauls, and although it wasn't his usual practice to pick up strangers, something about the situation caught his attention. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, facing the road, its back turned to him as he slowly approached. Tom slowed the truck, his instincts telling him to stop. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was important. Maybe they needed help, or maybe he was just being overly cautious, but he couldn't leave someone stranded out here in the fog, especially in such a remote area. As he came closer, his truck's headlights bathed the figure in a dim, eerie light. It was a person, he assumed, but something was off. The figure was unnaturally still, its body rigid, as if it had been frozen in place for hours. Tom squinted, trying to get a better look, and that's when he noticed something even stranger. The figure was dressed in hospital clothes, a pale, ragged hospital gown. It seemed like an odd thing to be wearing, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. The figure didn't seem to acknowledge the truck's approach at all. Tom hesitated, his heart rate increasing. He couldn't explain why, but the sight of the person gave him an unsettling feeling, like something was wrong. Something deeper than just a person stranded on the side of the road. He had the eerie sensation that the figure didn't belong there. Not in the fog, not in the middle of the night, and certainly not in hospital attire. As he passed the figure, Tom felt his stomach twist. Something made him glance in the side mirror. The figure hadn't moved, still standing motionless on the side of the road, watching the truck disappear into the mist. But as Tom's gaze lingered on the mirror, something shifted. The figure was now facing him. Its head turned slowly, in an unnatural, jerky motion, as if it wasn't used to moving at all. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he saw its face, or rather, what was left of it. The face was distorted, frozen in an expression of shock and terror, eyes wide open, staring straight at him. It was as if the figure had been trapped in that moment of horror, caught forever in that one frozen expression. The eyes, black and hollow, seemed to pierce through the fog and directly into Tom's soul. A chill ran down his spine. In a panic, Tom slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing the truck faster down the highway, desperate to put distance between himself and the figure. He didn't dare look back. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to calm himself, focusing only on the road ahead, willing himself not to glance in the rearview mirror again. But the image of the face, the distorted, ghostly eyes, haunted him. It felt like the figure was still watching him, even though he had long since passed it. He drove for what seemed like an eternity, the fog thickening around him as he pushed further down the highway. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. It was as if the figure was somehow keeping pace with him, lurking just out of sight. His headlights illuminated the road in front of him, but every now and then he swore he saw shadows moving in the periphery, shapes darting just outside the glow of the truck's lights. By the time he reached the next town, Tom was on edge, his nerves frazzled and his mind spinning. He had never experienced anything like that before, never seen a figure like that in the fog, and certainly never felt that kind of dread in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't a normal encounter. It wasn't even something he could explain away.